we'll kick off there and allow people to join as we start. So thank you to everyone again for joining us for the latest of our weekly global industry calls. For anyone that hasn't joined before, these are an informal opportunity to share advice and best practice on how the industry is working through the current crisis. We've had some really great sessions of late. Last week we had Whitney Daly, who's the Vice President of Corporate Communications for Porter Novelli, share some really fascinating data from the Boston team in the States, looking at how COVID's impacting business and society. And we've had others from China and India, and we've got a really excellent guest today, which I'll move on to shortly as well. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. As always, I'll just kick off with a very brief update as to what we've been up to over the past few days. So it was this time last week that we hosted our inaugural virtual summit. It was the first time that we'd held a virtual summit. The original event was scheduled to take place in March, and as you know, everything got put on hold, and at short notice we had to turn around and put together an entirely new event and really figure out a new way to deliver value for the industry. So it was a learning curve for us, and we were really pleased with how it went. We had across 2 days. So we held one session in the morning and the next session in the afternoon to cater for international time zones. So we had 35 speakers across 2 days from 20 countries. Altogether, we had 35 countries represented around the world in terms of delegates. So it was a really awesome opportunity to see how the industry can kind of come together as a global community, and the feedback that we've had on the learning content has been excellent. So it's great to know that that concept works, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more of that going forward as we emerge both through this crisis and after it as well. Earlier this week, we welcomed Paul Scully. So we had a webinar with Paul Scully, who's the small business minister. So he was on hand to answer questions from members about financial packages, and was sharing advice on how to determine whether you're eligible for financial support for the government, from the government. So all of those resources and all those webinars are on our website. So I'd really encourage anyone to check those out. In addition to that, our COVID-19 communications task force has been steaming ahead with delivering support and representation to PR professionals across the world. So the most recent initiative that they've been involved with was a task form learning event which took place on Tuesday this week, and for that particular event we had Rachel Friend, who's the former chief executive of Weber Shandwick in the UK, and she appeared alongside a guy called Rob Six, who is the corporate communications lead at a multinational firm based in California called Avery Dennison. And they had a really interesting conversation about how PR consultants and agencies in this time can maximize their relationships with clients and really seek to elevate their standing amongst clients, and to kind of move from the kind of traditional PR consultant to the trusted strategic advisor. So they had a really honest and frank conversation, and we had both the agency side and the client side give their take on what advice they have for practitioners who want to make that step up. So that was a really interesting conversation, and it was the fourth in a series of task force forums that they produced. So I'll put the link to those in this chat box when our guest is speaking, so do feel free to check those out as well. So today I'm really pleased to be joined by Amanda Coleman. So Amanda is kind of one of the most well-established and well-respected crisis communicators in the UK. She has a tremendous amount of experience dealing in public sector communications across various areas. She's formerly of the Greater Manchester Police and led the communications to the Manchester Arena bombing. And in addition to that, she launched a crisis communications consultancy during lockdown as well, which was an interesting experience in itself. So we're really, really delighted that Amanda was able to join us. And I think particularly this week, and I'm sure we'll probably come to this during the questions, but it's been a fascinating week for crisis communicators, especially when we consider how the government's currently responding to stories that it's facing. So it'll be really interesting to hear Amanda share the lessons that she's learned, and also give her thoughts on the current pandemic and how it impacts communicators. So there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A after, so do feel free to jump in then and share your questions. But for the moment, we'll hand over to Amanda for the next 10 to 15 minutes. So if I could just ask everyone to make sure their microphones are muted while Amanda's speaking, that would be great. And then we'll kick off with a Q&A shortly afterwards. So with that, Amanda, it's over to you.
All right. Thanks, Craig. Oh, I blogged last night about imposter syndrome, and I've got a massive feeling of it this morning with all these names of people that I've like, oh no, it's scary. God, who am I? Anyway, some thoughts. It wasn't the best time on day one of lockdown to think I was going to set myself up and start on this road of being self-employed, but hey, who knows? You have to grasp every nettle with with both hands. I have to say I'm absolutely loving it, which is a good sign, I'm sure, given everything else that's going on. Some thoughts for me. I mean, I've got a real sense of deja vu at the minute, because I spent a large part of last year, writing a book on crisis communication, which some people I know unfortunately have had to read, and I lived it all from start to finish, going through from planning, writing about recovery, and now now we're living it on a daily basis. And that's for me one of the weirdest things about the moment is when I was dealing with things within sort of emergency service and policing, if somebody had been personally affected by what was happening, you'd take them out of dealing with the communication because it's too difficult to try and deal with it when it's you're personally affected by it. But you can't at the minute because we're all affected by what we're going through, which brings a whole heap of extra stresses. And that for me was, if we can take away sort of anything for me, it's that the well-being element, and I know last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, one of the key bits is, that should be part of what we do on a daily basis. It shouldn't be that, we have a crisis suddenly like this, we suddenly realise we need to worry about people's mental health and people's well-being. We should be preparing for it. We should have it as part of a crisis plan. We should know that it's going to have that kind of impact on people, or potentially will do. But I could talk endlessly about all kinds of things, so I'll try not to. I'll try and keep focused. I think also it's about having stronger support networks. I've been speaking to quite a few heads of comms and people in different roles, and it's really obvious that I think certainly the last sort of 2 months, 8 weeks, whatever, people have been really busy, working really hard, and trying to do everything themselves without saying that they needed any help for anything. And it's almost impossible to do that without yourself collapsing at some point. And I'm really concerned from sort of where I'm sitting on the things at the minute, that there's going to be a lot of people facing severe burnout in the next few weeks, at a time when we need to be regrouping, ready for the next phase. And I don't think, I've got long convoluted reasons why we're not in recovery phase, anywhere near recovery phase yet. We're in mid-crisis phase, if anything. So we've got a long way to go with this, and the support networks, the PRCA is great stuff in terms of the support networks that it's putting in place, but those need to be there for a long period of time. Planning and testing, I think, would have been helpful for everybody whose business continuity plans suddenly became way more important than we ever thought they were. So, I would say that I'm doing crisis comms now as a job, but planning and preparing would hopefully come back into fashion, as in I think a lot of the people had put it on the back burner because there's always other things that needed to be done. I'll throw this in. Slogans aren't helpful when you're communicating a complex message. I have a dislike of slogans when the stuff gets way more complicated than just telling people to stay at home, but I won't go on about that. And what we're doing at the minute is learning to live with a crisis, and recovery will come at the rate that it needs to come. living with a crisis is a very difficult thing to try and get people to understand, but actually I don't think we credit the public with the sense that a lot of them have. For communicators, key bits, we're looking at, I think you've got to look at start to restructure and redesign. If you've got a corporate comms team, it's going to look very different going forward. I think it's going to have to. And I've got some thoughts about how you build crisis readiness into a team that is operating on normal business. We need to talk through and explain those next steps. We need to make sure that we're taking everybody with us. I think there's a massive role, and you mentioned it before, Karai, about supporting people at the top of an organisation who are probably really struggling at the minute with having to deal with the whole impact, the redesign potentially of the business, how that's going to work. And trying to keep morale up is a massive issue, and I think, you know, we need to look at factoring that in. But I think it's a massive opportunity for communicators to take this forward and to recognise what they can deliver. They have such a pivotal role to play, and you know, I've been heartened by hearing government ministers talk about the very important critical role from the start of the. I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but you know, I think it's an opportunity that people can grasp and take forward. And then next 3 to 6 months, I think you've got a lot of scenario planning that needs to be put in place, and we need to going to have to get comfortable with uncertainty, because it's going to be with us for quite a period of time, and with the flexibility that we need to build in, we're going to have to get flexible around working, and perhaps that's a different way. You know, it's not just working from home flexibility, but I think flexibility around a whole range of things as well. As I've said, recovery will happen, and when it does, it brings with it a great level of complexity, and we've got to have to understand that and be and just recognise that it is complex, it is hard, it's nowhere near as easy as the start of a crisis. The bit that comes 6 months, 12 months later is way more complex. People need to be debriefing. I get frustrated when people are saying that they haven't got time. You should be debriefing what you're doing on a regular basis, because you forget. I'm sure I can't remember what I did on day one of lockdown now. So, you know, debriefing, noting, and making sure you're keeping that information, because the crisis planning that you will need to do going forward has to take account of what you're doing now and what you've been doing. And the other thing I've got is that crises don't happen neatly in a row. So we've already seen floods in Canada. There's been the plane crash in Pakistan. What you know, crisis will happen as we're already living through one. So, you know, that's why, if I sound boring to people, which I probably do, you debrief because you know that you might have to review your plan and get it ready to implement again at some point whilst you're already dealing with something else. And don't wait for, I was reading something about phrases that people hate. Unprecedented. I avoid using that now, which is good because nobody likes it. New normal, that's a banned phrase as well. But we can't wait for a return to normal, whatever normal is. We're just going to need to deal with the uncertainty and start planning what the future would look like. And I was just talking before this at a global communications summit, which was quite, again, imposter syndrome. The guy who was talking before, who seemed to be an academic, because I had to really try and listen into what he was saying, was talking about trying to make the future, so that as well as, you know, you're dealing with the narratives of what the future looks like, is that you're actively trying to shape what that future, you know, could look like, which I think is what we're going to need to do. And I could probably talk again lots, I could talk about lots more, but I won't, so I'll keep it to that.
Thanks very much for that, Amanda. I'm sure those joining us have got a few questions, but I'd like to kick off with one in particular. You mentioned that you think slogans aren't helpful, particularly when the messages that need to be communicated are more complex and probably worthy of more considered messaging. What would your advice be for organisations in those positions who are responsible for formulating those messages, if they're not to rely on slogans which may typically be useful in normal circumstances? What would you say they should be doing, concentrating on?
Yeah, I liken it to like having a tapestry. So there'll be lots of different threads that all come together to make a picture. But actually, you need to look at the simple stuff. You know, who do we want to speak to? What are we trying to say to them? And at the start, I have no problem with the stay home message because it was really clear and it was what we needed to know. All right, there's lots of other bits I would like to know about it, but in its essence, it did what it needed to. But now this is way more complicated, and I have another reason why slogans don't work. Top-down slogans from government are never going to work when you've got lots of local information and local things that you need to do. So there is a need to be able to get down to a local level and get some and let things play in that level, which I don't think we've got at the moment. And I'm just tuning in today to some of the issues about the launch this morning, that public sector agencies are just getting, here's the app. Well, how does it work? What does it mean? What have we got to do? They're key in this, and they could make that message really live. And I think that's why you've seen mayors in Greater Manchester, Liverpool and other places speak out, because they are getting the local concerns raised with them quite quickly. So that's why I say it gets more complicated, because you've got to do that, the sort of mapping across who your stakeholders are, who the key groups, who are the people you want to speak to. The thing I was talking about just before I came on here was consequence management, which is something that would be really critical. You know, who are the most affected people? Who are the people outside that? Where do we need to prioritize the information? And then you get the messaging around that. It's easier to do, even though it becomes more complicated because you've targeted it down. Like I say, I'll talk endlessly if you let me, but in a nutshell, that's why I don't like slogans.
It's a really interesting issue, and I think the point about the stakeholder map constantly changing is so important, especially when we consider that there's a distinct possibility that certain communities in the UK are going to be experiencing different levels of restrictions or lockdown compared to others. So, a blanket slogan is not going to cut it. And I think there are probably principles of that which we could apply to all general communications, about just being smarter and really understanding your audience. So, that's really interesting to hear. I've got tons of other questions that I could ask Amanda, but I'm conscious that we've got quite a big group with us today. So is there anyone else who'd like to jump in and ask a question for Amanda?
Yeah, hi, Marcus here. Sorry, I just put something in the chat. So I'm interested, obviously you come from a police background, don't you, if I'm right in thinking, and obviously at a local authority, we're starting to get to the bit where things are starting to come back. I accept we are still within a crisis, but the feeling is we're now starting to get back into recovery. So I was interested in your views. You think we're still mid-crisis and we're not got to recovery yet?
Yeah, no, and there's and I won't bore you with what's in the. I keep saying this in the book, but I've got like 7 questions that are kind of critical for me around how much resources on still on the recovery phase, on the crisis phase. What's the mood and tone? What are people's views? How are people still being affected? If you take all those into account, then we are mid-crisis, because there are still massive numbers of people being affected by this. So that's in itself is a fundamental that we're not actually at recovery. The thing I'll just liken it to is it was literally probably the end of the first week of dealing with the Manchester Arena aftermath that the City Council and lots of other people who were dealing with the response said we're in recovery. We're going to recovery. We've done the first few days. We're in recovery. And it was myself and the head of comms at the City Council and the Mayor's office comms at that time. Well, like, we are not in a position to publicly say this is towards recovery. Too many people are still really hurting by what happened. You just haven't, we're just nowhere near. So whilst internally there was lots of talk of recovery and building things back and what we were doing, it was never public until the time was right. Probably not until the kind of the One Love concert happened, which was another week and a bit after that. So you're right, you will be starting to plan for recovery whilst you're still in a crisis. Would you publicly say that? Probably not, because I think the mood and tone and the things that you kind of get through is we're not there yet. I don't know if that sort of helps.
No, I suppose part of our challenge is that we're responding to what the government are saying as well, aren't we? So,
Yeah.
you know, they may, obviously they want to be upbeat and try and get to a point where people feel they can have their lives back, but we know we're not there yet, and that's what, as a local authority, we have to respond to that. So
Yeah.
that's why I think many people think, or the way the government are expressing their policy at the moment is that we're on the way to recovery, and therefore, quite rightly, we should start thinking about that too. But obviously, we've got to be careful on the messaging. So that was a kind of dichotomy of the difficult place we're in at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Marcus. And you know, when you consider the number of people still losing their lives, okay, in the grand COVID-19 scheme of things, it might seem reduced, but if you just consider the fact, I think it was like 150 people that died yesterday or something.
Uh-huh.
If these were anywhere like normal times, that would be a kind of a catastrophic loss. So
Exactly.
it just shows that you do really need to kind of be extremely sensible and sensitive in approaching comms around it. Another chat, a question in the chat box from Steve in regard.
Yeah, I can shout it out. Hi, Amanda. Great to see you.
Hello.
Police forces are really good in times of crisis of rolling out their top person to make a statement. People like Cresta Dixon within the Met and within Greater Manchester, and really having an authoritative spokesperson getting the key message over. Do you think the government has completely failed in having too many spokespeople to get these messages out? And what advice would you have given them?
Yeah, there's lots of advice I'd like to give them. My mum keeps saying I should send the book. Send the book to Boris. Anyway, that's a side issue. But no, I think one of the problems was that they took a little while to get the daily press conference up and running. That then creates you a problem because you're on the back foot really with some things. Whereas, as I say, the standard that we would have in terms of a police response is, I mean, we had some after the arena. It was 5 hours, 6 hours for the first press conference we did. Now I know that's a slightly different set of circumstances, but the time, the lag that we had in getting somebody to speak regularly was dramatic. You do, I mean, with something that's going to take a period of time, you do have to have a number of people. I think that's key. I think the problem is it seems really if you're somebody watching it. So it's not it's this person, or this person, and you've got, say, a list of 4 people potentially. It could be anybody. It depends on what the issue of the day is going to be, and I'm not convinced that helps people who are watching. It might make sense to the government to have, you know,
I think we may have lost Amanda there. You just bear with me. We'll just give it a minute or so and see if she can rejoin. Just a second.
Those are Steve's difficult questions.
He's in the rural northwest, remember? People are asking about the sound. Can you hear my voice? This is a test.
Yeah,
Yep.
we've got Amanda back now. So if you just bear with me, she should be back any second.
Sorry,
That's
me.
all right.
I had an IT failure. Sorry, am I coming in mid conversation?
No, go for it.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so going back to saying, Steve, I think you do need to have somebody who to speak. You do need someone at senior level. You do need to have a number of people. I'm not convinced that this is working because of the nature of it, and also I think that there's the press conference, the daily press conference, has become very formulaic. So I don't think it's actually capturing people anymore. And actually, they probably could have knocked it on the head a while ago, and found other ways of doing it, but. I'm not quite sure why they still keep tortuously going through it. I also have a massive. I don't like it because it just talks about numbers and there's never any humanity in it. There's never any people elements to it, and I think that kind of detracts from what people are experiencing within their lives at the moment.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Amanda. I think it's kind of they're losing their value with every conference that takes place, and I think part of it's a good point about them starting off on the back foot. And we had a situation where ministers were briefing the journalists that had, ministers were briefing journalists who were publishing content behind paywalls and were dealing with critical information at a really important time that wasn't immediately accessible to everyone. So it did go to show that they were kind of forced into it. And I feel like that's carried through all the way. Did anyone else have any other questions for Amanda? I see Carmel and I see Stephen as well. Do you want to go ahead and then we can move on to Carmel?
Yeah, sure. Just jumping in. Amanda, thanks for that presentation. It's really good. Like your book, by the way, I need to write a review, sorry. But I just wanted to ask about if we accept that we're going to have to live with COVID-19, and that implies we're going to have to live with social distancing. How the hell do you begin to scenario plan? And this is blowing my mind. How do you scenario plan for any aspect of culture or society or business that is impacted by that? Because it's so fundamental. So things like theatres, cinemas, things like sporting events. Can you ever imagine that we'll be able to have a rugby scrum again? And then things like universities, how the hell are universities going to get back to normal? So, yeah, just any thoughts about what it means to something that is so fundamentally shifted that it might never be the same again.
I know, and I think we just have to accept that. So for me, it's very much you need that blank piece of paper, and you have to try and forget way things have been almost to start trying. You've got blocks in front of you. You have to put them back together in a whole different way, and yes, if you start to think about it, it becomes massive, doesn't it? Like you said, all the things and the things you used to do, and that's why it is so difficult to be living it and trying to plan for the future of what it looks like, because we're so fundamentally affected by it. But for me, as I say, I just go back to a blank piece of paper, and you've got to leave behind all that attachment to things as they were to try and look at how it might be. And I say that's why I started just thinking about comms team. If you're an in-house comms team and you've got to live with a level of uncertainty, risk, crisis, and still function and do day to day, it's a different mindset. And it will look different, it will feel different, but I think that within that there's some massive opportunities. That's and I'm I'm not one of these people who's been going, oh, lockdown's great, I've been baking bread and having a fancy salmon or whatever it is. But I do think there are some opportunities out of this to create things stronger, to build some resilience into people that we didn't have, because we're not particularly resilient communities. and resilient. I mean, you know, we're not resilient people, really, to be fair. We've not been focused on planning for pandemics. We've kind of done, this is where I go off on a rant if I'm not careful. We've kind of done some planning around, you know, things that might happen, but not really thought that ever would. Other countries are very different. The UK is very much like, I think it just hasn't grasped what it needed to do. So there's lots of opportunities that go forward to make people perhaps they get more resilience into things and build things. I mean, God, Greater Manchester's got some weird "build it back better" slogan that they're trying to use from the mayor's office. I don't like it. I don't like slogans particularly at this stage, but I do see what they're trying to do, which is, you know, trying to build things stronger, better, different, and accept what's past in some cases.
Thank you for that. Just on the chat, I've seen that Kerry's just on Wads's point about planning. Kerry has said that 2023 is starting to emerge now for lots of brands and organisations as a date for any return to normality for numbers, profits, attendance, etc. So, yeah, just that does show that it's very much a long game in terms of returning to what we knew before. Carmel, would you like to go ahead with the question that you had for Amanda?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Amanda. Some fantastic insight there, really useful. Just also, could I pick up on what Steve was asking about, you know, working in a university with university students and teach around crisis communications. And we are having to plan actively at the moment and work with what is a very, you know, daily fluctuating situation in terms of recruitment, whether we're doing any face-to-face teaching, whether we're doing a mixture of face-to-face and blended learning, lots of, you know, mostly around delivering teaching online, certainly for the first semester. So it's changing all the time, but we're having to start somewhere. And I think what Amanda's saying about there'll be lots of stuff that we've learned that's really, really useful for the future, for building resilience, that's already happening. You know, the fact that we can have this meeting, which is much more accessible, certainly for someone like me based in Sheffield, to join this meeting, much easier for me to do that on a Zoom basis than it is to actually physically do face-to-face. I think in very simple ways, there's some really compelling new resources already coming through that's going to make life different and more interesting and exciting. And my question, sorry, long lead in, but yeah, we're getting on with it in universities. Amanda, I'd be interested to know your view on, with the daily press conference, there's been this recent introduction of questions from members of the public, including our man of the cloth the other day, which I thought was quite old-fashioned from Matt Hancock. What's your view on whether that works? It feels very clunky and uncomfortable for me, but I just wondered what your view was on that, please.
Yeah, I get the sentiment. I can see what they're trying to do, which is how do you develop that sort of engagement with people. I don't think that's the vehicle to do it, and that's why it probably feels clunky. I do think that, you know, those conversations should be being had at a local level, with local services. I think if I'm honest, I also think it's an opportunity to take some time out of the journalists and take some of the heat out of that, and to choose some questions that you might like to get asked, because then, you know, you're going to be asked the right questions to tell the right answers. But yeah, I get the sentiment, and I think it's a nice idea, but I'm not convinced. And we'll all know that somebody will be sat in the background going, "Oh, ask that question because that's a really good one," or that's, you know, whatever. I never think those things look as authentic as perhaps they hope they look. I also think, you know, press conferences, I'm a bit of I was a journalist by trade originally. I kind of think they're for journalists, really. Let them use that. And then, you know, have other mechanisms where you can have proper, because it's not proper engagement, it's just literally you might have a posted question from a member of the public. Proper engagement with the public's where we need to be going, because that's how you can get the complexity of the messaging that we were talking about, really.
Brilliant, thank you. Totally agree. Also an ex-journalist, so yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was interesting watching Matt Hancock struggle with that question, wasn't he? And he got forced into a position where he promised a review of for anyone who's faced a penalty for childcare issues during lockdown.
Yeah, there was also the kind of strange quaintness of referring to this man of the cloth, you know, which just not appropriate, really, really sort of cringeworthy. So, but lots of those moments to reflect upon, I think.
Yeah, there's been a whole series of those, hasn't there, over the past couple of months?
Yeah.
Did anyone have any other questions for Amanda? Siobhan?
Hi, Amanda, thanks. And, you know, got a copy of the book and plowing through it, so thank you. It's a really good read. The question that I've got is around a crisis that I think that we might be sort of entering that's a bit hidden from view. And that's about a workforce that is struggling to balance managing the demands of work and the demands of family life, and that women seem disproportionately affected by this if they're in a two-parent family or home. And I just wonder what you think about, you know, I suppose it's akin to Stephen's question in terms of it's a crisis that will have a long tail to it. How do we you know, prepare organizations and manage the impact of that, and prepare people to have the right conversations?
Yeah, it's right. I think it's very much around it's trying to explain to people that this isn't, you know, you can't do the same amount of work in the same way when you're at home as you would do if you were sat in an office. You can't, I was, you know, talking about kind of well-being yesterday, you know, you can't keep an eye on how people are just, you know, by a Zoom call or by a phone call. Because it's easy to look at somebody and go, everything's fine, you know, I'm fine, it's all good, for an hour. You couldn't do that in the office because you'd spot it if they were struggling, and you'd see it and you'd see the signs. So there's lots of things that we've taken for granted because of that physical contact that you would have, that we need to reimagine, in a very American phrase, but, you know, we need to think about it in a different way. We need to look in a different way. And I think, how can we help organizations? It's about, you know, explaining it, showing them, talking to, you know, speaking to staff and getting staff information, staff data that will show that how difficult things are. That's the way, you know, it's trying to really make it real to them. I would think in some cases, though, the good thing, if we'll find positives about people in senior positions, is they've been in the same position in a lot of respects in terms of trying to deal with business remotely, and struggling in lots of cases to do it. So there hopefully would be some empathy around it that would, you know, from them actually living it and experiencing it. But yeah, it's very much starting with that blank piece of paper and saying, you know, how do you build a team? How do you build a workforce? How do you build somebody to do the job we need to do? And is the job the same job that we were doing beforehand anyway? And sometimes it's not going to be. I still struggle to see how pubs and places, you know, like pubs and things are going to work, even with the measures that was sort of been talked about in the last sort of 24 hours. So perhaps we need to think about it and reimagine it, and then to develop it in a different way. Perhaps it has to look very different by, like Kerry says, 2023. So we will be doing some kind of normal pub, whatever, but it's in a different way. You know, I don't know if that helps.
Thanks, Amanda. Did anyone have any other final questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, sorry, it's Marcus again. I was just interested in the fact that this is a national crisis, but it's impacting the country at different stages. So some bits will be coming out, or other bits might be going further into it. So how does the government manage that with regards to messaging and trying to keep, you know, keep the public on message really, and just keeping to the social distancing rules, etc., etc.
Yeah, you'll like this, Marcus, because I think it means more work for you, to be fair.
Tell me about it. Yeah.
No, realistically, what they've been trying to do up until now is a central message for everybody, and I said before, that doesn't work as you start to go forward, because it gets more complicated. So for me, the government should be setting the framework. This is the overall. This is the big picture, and then trust to those local services who know the people in the area, who know what's going on, who know how things play out, to be able to then make it work on that local level, and take account of the fact that if we're going to be in a position where potentially Greater Manchester is going to have a lockdown, but down the road Liverpool isn't, because the levels are different, then that's never going to work from a top-down messaging, believe me, and we'll all know, you know, that's never going to work. It needs to work on a local level from people that you trust who are in those positions that you know, that understand the areas. So that's, for me, the only way I could see that you could realistically try and take that forward.
Yeah, and the track and trace is supposed to help manage some of that as well, isn't it? So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, because I know, you know, people like yourself, and I've been there in public services, I've been massively stretched over the years anyway, and before all this, so it's just an extra level, but really that's the most effective way you're going to deal with it, isn't it? But
yeah, and a business as normal doesn't exist, does it? And you know, everything goes out the window and you do the crisis. But the challenge now is you start getting to the point where business as normal starts popping its head above the parapet, like consultations and other similar type stuff. That's where it becomes very difficult for us as comms people to try and split our resources and still find out what's important.
And any additional resource that you've got will probably have gone, because everybody's gone, oh well, the initial crisis bit's finished. But actually you need more resource in the recovery, towards the recovery, in the recovery phase, than you probably do right back at the start, to be honest.
And like you said, burnout is a factor as well, isn't it? Yeah.
And people got holidays they need to take, and people need to just get away from things, and that's a difficult message to those at the top of an organisation, though, when they're trying to get back to you know, business and looking at business. Just as an aside, though, something that still makes me smile inside, I suppose. So the arena bombing happened on the Monday night. The Tuesday midday-ish, somebody will remain nameless, from within Greater Manchester Police suddenly got in touch with the PR team to say, oh, you know, this kind of PR thing we were going to do, I can't remember what it was now. It's still going ahead today, isn't it? No. So you'd be surprised how people, you know, you think people would realise what we're dealing with, but sometimes, you know, they don't, even though they might be quite sensible people on a daily basis.
No, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, is that a part of our role, well, now more than ever, is to kind of just give context to everything. So it's about helping other people in different parts of the organisations understand this wider environment and how it affects us. And that's always been the case, but I think it's never been more important.